The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you for joining today's live webinar, What are the plans for providing controls for governance with Microsoft PowerApps and Flow? My name is Danny Smith, and I am the Manager of Events and Marketing at Microexcel, and I will be moderating today. During today's presentation, we will discuss how to successfully formulate governance frameworks for PowerApps and Flow, including licensing, environments and quotas, common data service, and much more. We will also guide you through a recommended governance plan. Our presenter for today is Mr. Justin Sypek, a technology professional with over 16 years of experience architecting, designing, and developing Windows, web, and SharePoint applications using the Microsoft technology stack. Mr. Sypek is a Microsoft P seller on the productivity stack for the New York Metro. As the head of the Microsoft practice for Microexcel, Mr. Sypek oversees the global development and delivery teams for the entire Microsoft technology stack. We have just a few laundry items to share with you before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent out in a few days. Also, we will have a Q&A portion at the end, so please type any questions you may have in the questions box, and we will get to those in the order they are received. If you have questions after the webinar, please feel free to contact us at info@microexcel.com. All attendees are also eligible for a complimentary PowerApps and Flow Plan 2 trial, which includes 25 user licenses. A link to accept this offer will be included in the email along with the recording of today's presentation. At the conclusion of today's webinar, there will be a brief survey. Please take a few moments and share your thoughts with us. So without further ado, I'd like to present our speaker for today's event, Mr. Justin Sypek.
Thanks, Danny, and welcome everybody. Appreciate you taking the next 45 minutes or so to listen to our PowerApps and Flow discussion. Just real quick, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Microexcel, the organization which is providing this webinar for you all today. We're established in 2001. We're headquartered in Secaucus, New Jersey. We've got global locations across the US in New York, New Jersey, California, Chicago, Utah, as well as India and Dubai. We do not only Microsoft solution consulting services, but we also do SAP test automation as well as interactive design. We're about 1,500 strong across our global locations and truly looking to provide our customers with the best consulting service we can. From a Microsoft standpoint, what we're trying to do is sort of guide our customers through their digital transformation journey. And that is really around that Microsoft cloud stack, right? Office 365, Dynamics 365, and Azure. So we've identified 4 pillars of that digital transformation, those 4 pillars being planning, adopting, managing, and embracing all of those cloud solutions. And what we try to do is and help guide them through from start to finish to where they can truly find the value of those applications. So we try to guide our customers through their initial journey with some envisioning, road mapping session, right? Have conversations like we're going to have today around governance, understand the technologies that they may want to leverage, what types of licensing are required, and sort of look at their current IT landscape and potentially a future IT landscape, leveraging software as a service, platform as a service, or even infrastructure as a service. Then talk to them about some type of migrations. What workloads do you want to light up? Developing some, rich portals that may sit on top of, let's say, a SharePoint Online, and defining some of that process automation. Right today, process automation. We're going to talk about being that PowerApps and Flow. Obviously, when you onboard new technologies, new capabilities, moving from an on-prem scenario to a cloud scenario, there's a requirement for potentially some type of additional support, being able to provide some knowledge transfer to your internal team around how do I manage that software as a service where, I don't necessarily have as much admin capabilities around the virtual machines and the infrastructure as I used to in the past, and we can support our customers and guide our customers through that transition as well. And then lastly, it's really about embracing all of those technologies, whatever fits in that Microsoft stack, and building those custom applications, right? Defining the business intelligence, the data analytics, and even doing integration across, let's say, Dynamics 365, Office 365, Project Online, whatever fits in that stack, and Power Apps and specifically Flow really provide that capability for us. So real quick, an agenda for today, and Danny highlighted this a little bit earlier on, but let's just review. We're going to talk just briefly, what is general governance, right? What is the meaning of it? And before you can really define governance, I think it's important to understand the fundamentals of what Power Apps and Flow really include, and that is going to be that licensing, administrative capabilities, certainly technical considerations, understanding the platform limitations and planning for those, and understanding what does a deployment process look like. Then we'll talk about a high-level governance plan, which sort of encompasses everything that we talked about within the fundamentals, and obviously we will leave some time for Q&A at the end. So real quick, before we start, just wanted to ask a couple of people, what are you currently leveraging Office 365 for? Are you adopting it? Is there a migration that's underway today? Is your organization too scared and not willing to move to something like software as a service, right? So let's see where everybody's at.
Okay, Justin, I will now be closing the poll. And it looks like 15% responded with software as a service all the way. We're using Office 365. 31% said we are evaluating Office 365. And 54% answered with we are currently migrating from on-prem to Office 365.
That's a big part that's migrating, so appreciate that. Thanks, everybody. So let's ask Cortana. Hey, Cortana, what is governance? So if we ask Cortana, she's probably going to pop up Bing, and one of the Bing results is going to be, a definition where the action or manner of governing is what governance is. And I always feel like whenever you use the word in the definition, you're not really getting very much out of it, right? So we'll just facepalm on that one. And let's take a look at what Gartner has. So Gartner really defines IT governance in a couple of different ways, right? And it's truly defining a process that helps IT and the organization achieve its overall goals, right? Goals from a technology perspective. And there's certainly something called the IT demand governance. And that is more around the process around defining the way that you're going to implement technologies, the way that you're going to secure technologies, the way that you're going to measure, in fact, if those technologies that you've rolled out have been successful and if they're worth the value that has been injected into them, right? So we're going to take that idea, the fundamentals of governance being, there is a technology that exists and we want to plan the usage, we want to plan the security, and we want to plan how that technology is going to provide value to the end user, but also how is that technology going to be administered by IT or some all-encompassing administrator. And again, one of the things that we'll take a look at is the fundamentals of Power Apps and Flow, and again, that's a core requirement before we really define the governance. So yet again, one last poll question that I'm going to ask everybody is, what are you guys currently doing from a workflow or forms process today? Do you guys love your InfoPath and SharePoint Designer workflows on your SharePoint 2007 instances? You guys using third-party products, or have you already rolled out Power Apps and Flow? Or are we cavemen and still using pen and pad?
Okay, Justin, I'll now be closing the poll. And it looks like 40% responded with what ain't broke, don't fix. We love InfoPath and SharePoint Designer workflow. 27% responded with currently leveraging Nintex and K2 or K2 forms and or workflows. 27% responded with already using Power Apps or Flow, just don't know how to govern. And 7% answered with pen and paper here, lots of pen and paper.
All right, very good. So it looks like a lot of people still using SharePoint Designer, probably where I would have put myself as well. So let's take a quick look at licensing, right? Because this is one of the things that I think we need to understand a little bit, and maybe isn't necessarily highlighted as well from a Microsoft standpoint, right? So PowerApps and Flow has been out for just about 2 years now. Went to general availability November 2016, right? And we were all able to go and sign up for PowerApps and Flow and in our Office 365 tenant. It really ended up being its own subscription that we assigned to people, and we got 10,000 subscriptions that we could roll out to our organization. And really, that was still just a preview mode, right? So what that sort of turned into, it's turned into what is Microsoft Flow for Office 365. So any of your existing 365 plans, you know, your business essentials, business premiums, E1, E3, E5, they all include this flow for 365. And for the most part, there is really no difference between the actions that you can use across the flow. What you do get with some of these paid plans, and you'll see there's a plan 1 and a plan 2 for $5 and $15 respectively. What you do get out of those additional paid plans is more runs per month, right? So that's geared towards that flow quota that we'll talk about a little bit later. Also allows you the ability of maybe trimming down some of your checks, right? Some of the more frequent times that you can actually query list items, let's say, or query variables within your workflows, and then some premium connectors. So you can see a little bit more detail in terms of the capabilities that exist, and the reality is the flow for 365 is good for the majority of your business users, the ones that are going to be executing flows. Where you need to start thinking about paid plans, it's if you're looking to do some premium integration with, let's say, a Salesforce or an Oracle. If you really do want to add more flow runs and recognize that those flow runs right now are on a per user basis, but in reality they aggregate across into just one single tenant flow run usage, right? So if we had 15 users that were all running that 15,000 flow quota, it doesn't mean that each one of those users is going to have 15,000. It means that as an organization, we're going to be able to use all of those together. And one of the biggest things, again, is taking a look down a little bit on the bottom of the management, being able to create those environments, right? Deploying your flows into multiple environments, which we're going to get into a lot more detail. So just one thing before we feel like we've got to go spend $15 on these Flow Plan 2 licenses, and maybe you think that's not too bad, let's talk about PowerApps, because PowerApps actually has paid plans as well. And the paid plan for PowerApps is substantially more expensive at $40 a user a month for that plan too. And if you take a look, that really is something for called makers and admins. We'll talk about makers and admins a little bit later on when we talk about the roles. But one of the things that we want to consider from a PowerApps paid usage perspective is leveraging that common data service. So that's something, again, being able to create a common data service is only available in a Power App Plan 2. If you want to leverage any of the workflows that actually have common data service actions, you need that Power App Plan 1, or in reality a Flow Plan 1 license. Keep in mind that these Power App Plan 2 licenses actually encompass a Flow Plan 2 license. So it's not that you've got to go spend $15 on a user for Flow and then another $40 on a user for a Power App plan. You've got the ability of just having a Power App plan, and that will give you everything that you have in those Flow Plan 2s, right? So you can see that the flow runs per month quotas are exactly the same on a Plan 2 for Power Apps as they were on a Plan 2 for Flow. And lastly, the only thing that the Power Apps Plan 2 license again has that the Plan 1 wouldn't would be being able to create those environments. So some good decisions need to be made around roles and responsibilities, and how much do you plan on leveraging forms versus workflows to really identify, do we want to get paid plans of Power Apps Plan 2, or do we want to get paid plans of Flow Plan 2, let's say. So we'll talk about the fine print real quick. Keep in mind a couple of things. Those Power Apps Plan 2 licenses and those Flow Plan 2 licenses are the ones that are going to allow you to create something called a common data service. That common data service can only be consumed by other paid plans as well. So that's going to be one of the limitations that we've got to define when we start planning out development of our workflows. All of the users in, let's say, a Flow Plan 2 or a Power App Plan 2 have the ability of creating environments. Those environments, however, can only be created 2 per user account. And we'll get into environments, right after this. The last thing is, you want to create some data loss prevention policies. That's going to be a Flow Plan 2 at least, or again, a Power Apps Plan 2 license. So from an environment perspective, we feel this is probably one of the most valuable adds that Microsoft has given to us in a software as a service capability. We haven't had this to date, right? There's no such thing as being able to create a development tenant and a production tenant, let's call it, for SharePoint, right? Sure, you can go and create a site collection for development and a site collection for production, and then you can have some process to migrate content and migrate customizations from dev to prod. But all of that truly exists within that same tenant, which is administered by the same group. So what we've got now is we actually have the ability of creating multiple environments within our one Office 365 tenant. So the sample that we have here is I've got my generic dev test production environments, right? So maybe dev is going to be where internal IT dev team is going to be go and create some Power Apps and Flow. Test is where we're going to provide some user acceptance testing with some data that replicates production, and obviously production is where we're going to have our final Power App and Flow and that common data model. So we need a process for being able to deploy across these multiple environments, right? But we also need a process for what do we want these environments to be. So today, in this quick little scenario, we've got environments that are targeted towards location. So we've got our US, our Canadian, and our Australian environments. All 3 of those environments have a dev, test, and production, right? Let's recognize, as we're talking about being able to create these environments, that the same administrator cannot create all 9 of these environments. The same administrator actually can't even create the 3 environments that are on that Contoso USA, right? Because we only truly have the ability of creating 2 of those environments per one of those user accounts themselves. So the environments themselves gives us the ability of separating those Power Apps, separating our flows, separating our business data, and identifying different roles and responsibilities for those users. We can create the environments for a team, a department, a location. There's a couple of different reasons why we might want to create different environments that we'll talk through, and we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of let's at least call it dev test and then production environments. So you could absolutely build all of your flows in a single environment. Nothing's stopping you, right? When you load up Office 365 and you go and sign up for a Power App or Flow trial, or if you've already got a subscription and you assign one of those licenses to a user, Microsoft is going to create a default environment for you. That default environment ends up having access for all of the users within your tenant. So that's something to keep in mind. And you've got the ability of going and people can go and create flows in that environment. Again, not too much on defining any governance around that environment. It just happens to be there for everybody. And last, again, maybe you want to target your locations based on maybe some language or some geolocation. So I mentioned that Power Apps and Flow rolled out, let's call it December or November 2016. When it rolled out, the administration for Power Apps and Flow was within your generic Office 365 admin console, right? And it was nice. You have the ability of going to a Power App or going to a Flow and checking the environments, right? One thing I should mention again is the environments are shared across both of those technologies, right? So you'll have a single environment and both Power Apps and Flow connect to that same instance, that same environment. So through your O365 console, you're going to see a list of your environments, your data policies, maybe the connections that you've created. You see a list of all of your Power Apps and Flows that have been deployed, and if they're available, you see your common data model databases, you see the security that's been defined, and all of that is rolled up into this admin center. Well, one of the things that we like about Office 365 and in general software as a service are that things continually enhance, right? The product is continually evolving, and we've got the ability of having new features, new functionality rolled out on a monthly basis. Can't get anything better than that, right? Unfortunately, one of the limitations and one of the concerns about something that's greenfield like Office 365 is the fact that sometimes the customer experience needs to change while the product goes through that evolution. So if you go and if you create a new Power App or Flow environment today, or if you've done that in the last few months, you might notice that the experience around the administrative aspect has changed. Office 365 is certainly Microsoft's productivity platform. You've got Exchange, you've got Skype for Business, you've got SharePoint, OneDrive. It's your collaborative tools. And Dynamics 365 has certainly morphed more from Dynamics CRM to where it's Dynamics ERP. Right, we've got Dynamics Nav and AX, which is kind of our Dynamics 365 Business Edition. You've got Dynamics 365 Talent, and Dynamics 365 is now really the productivity stack of Microsoft. Well, part of productivity is not productivity. It's the business process. So part of the business process obviously would be Flow, right? Flow allows you to define your internal workflows, internal process. So it makes sense that that business process would now roll into a Dynamics 365 experience, less than an Office 365 experience. So if you see on the left here, I've got a snapshot of my D365 admin center, and it shows me I've got some production and sandbox, Dynamics CRM environment, but I also have like a MS Practice Dev, and Seth created a nice preview trial instance of Power Apps and Flow. So those are actually two Flow environments. So if I go into that environment now, you'll see on the right side, it looks exactly like a Dynamics CRM, where I'm going to see my flows under that process center of Dynamics 365. And if I click on that Microsoft Flows, now I have the ability of seeing all of those, my flows, etc. So one thing to keep in mind, obviously, is we've got to understand that there's different customer experiences between a Power App or Flow environment that's probably your default, as well as one that you maybe created in the last couple of months. So we've talked about the roles. We talked about the environments. One of the things that we need to discuss are roles and really understanding permissions and how we can administer these environments. So Power Apps and Flow really have three different roles. One role is just your general user base. I'm not going to get into that in much detail, right? You can define your users for a different environment. They're really just consumers of any Power App or Flow that was deployed in an environment. Really what we've got environment admins and environment makers. The environment admin is the all-encompassing owner of that environment. They're the ones that created it. They can add other environment admins. They can add environment makers. They're the ones that are provisioning that common data service database for the environment. They're managing all of the resources. They're setting up data loss prevention policies, and they're assigning business data and data groups, etc. The environment makers are more the business owner, more the power user, the people that are actually going in and creating the Power Apps and Flows. They're creating connections. They're creating connections to line of business data. Maybe they are setting up gateways through their accounts. They're the ones that are building the applications in those environments and sharing those applications with others within the organization themselves. They're the ones that are sort of assigning the users to the flows and apps that they build. And again, these environment admins and environment makers are typically going to be those planned to are what you need in order to provide an environment admin or an environment maker capability to the users. So we talked about Common Data Service a little bit, so let's get into that in some detail. So the Common Data Service really gives you the ability of creating a storage area for some information that you're going to be leveraging in a flow, right? So sure, there's the idea of variables, right? Think of this sort of as a persisted variable across the flow, where maybe you can go and you can query that value every time that flow ends up getting triggered. If you create Nintex workflows, you probably know about, the state machine workflow, and we've probably created a ton of them. If you've got, SharePoint on-prem and you're worried about your timer job recycling, or when anytime the environment gets rebooted and you don't want your entire workflow to start from scratch again, what you do is you save the state of that workflow. So anytime you need to reinitiate the workflow itself, it understands the state, and you don't have to duplicate tasks and functionality for users that have already gone through their part of the process, right? So if you wanted to replicate something like that in a flow, you could use this Common Data Service and push information, push variable data, push any content into that Common Data Service to be able to retrieve later within that flow. You can do it within multiple flows as well, but that Common Data Service is absolutely tied to a specific environment itself. So any flow that accesses the Common Data Service has to be in the same environment that Common Data Service itself lives. Now, look, we mentioned that requires, that Plan 2 license in order to provision these data services. That's fine. But one of the other things is you need a Plan 1, either a Flow Plan 1 or Power App Plan 1, in order to even retrieve information from that Common Data Service. So that's something to be aware of as well when you're sort of identifying the licensing, as well as being able to use some of this functionality. There's other ways that you can go and mimic and replicate what the Common Data Service does. You could easily, through a flow, have an Excel spreadsheet that sits on a OneDrive for Business account or on a SharePoint Online somewhere, and you could be able to push and pull content to that Excel spreadsheet. You could copy that file around, let's say. You could create your own Azure SQL database, and you could connect to that Azure SQL database through Flow, create a connection there, and be able to push and pull data into your Azure SQL. But why do those things, right? If the Common Data Service exists, and if you've got the ability of having default actions that allow you to manage the Common Data Service, as well as if there's some additional security around it, then why go and sort of manually replicate some of those capabilities when it's built for you in Flow in and of itself? One of the things that we need to talk about around, that Common Data Service is data loss prevention policies, these DLP policies, right? So we've seen this rolled out in Office 365 across the board. Compliance and security is certainly something of a concern, especially in a software as a service world. So why wouldn't you want to have data loss prevention policies around some of your business process and business data as well, right? So these data loss prevention policies allow you to define what actions you want to be able to have environment owners and makers and people creating flows, which actions they can create in a flow that are going to either allow or not allow access to, let's say, Facebook. So you can have a set of actions that is your business data, and that business data is going to be connecting to SharePoint, connecting to OneDrive, querying Exchange, right? Using Delve, stuff like that. And you see that there's something called the data group. So you would take those actions and you would put that in your business data only data group. And then you've got obviously connections to things like, Facebook and Twitter, or maybe Zendesk, and maybe you don't want to have some of that information integrated into a flow where you do have maybe some of your IP that sits in that SharePoint or OneDrive. So you would have that in your no business data. And what you can't do is in a flow, you can't have actions from both of those configured for that and for that flow within a specific environment, right? So the idea is that I can't take some of that IP that exists in SharePoint and post it in Twitter through a flow. I can certainly control that the connections within those data groups, and I can move them back and forth. Those data groups are on a per environment basis. So you could have certain environments maybe that have a little bit looser of a DLP policy, and maybe you've got an HR instance, and that HR environment has a much more rigorous data loss prevention policy. We've seen something very similar to this in Intune, right? Where you got your mobile device management solution, and people bring their own devices, and you connect those to Intune, and people have their personal profiles. Those personal profiles, people are on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and personal emails, and you don't want to mix that personal profile, let's say, with a corporate profile, right? So with Intune, you have your corporate profile that's connected to your Exchange Online account and has applications for let's call it SharePoint and stuff, but it doesn't have any of those other personal social aspects to it. So you can swap between your profiles and be able to do things, but what you can't do is you can't copy between those profiles. So very similar, that's what you're doing with these data loss prevention policies, where you're setting up the initial business and non-business set of data, and you don't allow the intermingling between the two. So from a multilingual support perspective, PowerApps and Flow, but more PowerApps than anything else, because PowerApps is really the front end. It's the visualization. It's what initiates a lot of the flows themselves, right? It's a global product, certainly. So why wouldn't there be multilingual support built into these products? SharePoint has always had your language packs, so this is something very similar. Something we didn't talk about too much in this session is the way that you can go and create a Power App or create a flow, right? But what there's Windows thick client applications, which you can download from the Windows Store, that allow you to create Power Apps and Flow. But there's also the web-based, right, components, which you can get to directly from Office 365. So if you're using your Windows client, if you're using those thick client applications, it's going to pull your language settings from Windows itself. Whereas if you're using Edge or Chrome, it's going to pull the language settings directly from the browser that you're using. So it's nice that it'll give you the ability of having that multilingual support from the form perspective. One thing that you want to recognize is to use as much out of the box as possible in terms of, right, Power Apps has some globally aware controls. Those globally aware controls are language and text and value and date value functions, right? So those types of things are automatically going to interpret and be able to do that language conversion for us. So it is definitely a global language, global supported product. And one of the things that you want to think about as well is, having environments that maybe are targeted towards that multilingual capability as well. So earlier on, we had our US and Canada and Australian environments, right? And you may wonder why. And again, maybe it's because there's, the French Canadian are the ones that are in that Canadian environment, and we need to have all of our forms displaying in French itself. So we're going to set the default language of that environment to French, and any of the flows or Power Apps that we end up creating, we're going to have that language conversion based on whoever's the owner, and if they sit in those areas, then their default Windows and web languages are going to be for that specific region. So certainly something that we want to plan early for our limitations, right? It's easy to define some governance up front and prevent users from being able to do something, or at least highlight the fact that capabilities may not exist, or we don't want to, extend or expose some of those capabilities to user. You do that early on, it's a lot easier to do it and have people understand that it's a limitation than have them going and trying it and then eventually telling them that they can't do it and taking some type of capability away. So from a Power App perspective, there's really not too much in terms of limitations. There's just general, web-based tryout, timeouts, and retry limits. Flow has a bit more, obviously, from a limitation perspective, and this is really because it's a workflow tool, right? And any workflow tool is going to have a set of limitations around, timings and recurrence and iterations of things. So you all can take a screen snag of this, or when we send out the video, you can take a look at it in more detail. I just want to highlight a couple of things. So from a limitation perspective, you can only have 250 flows per account, right? So again, remember, each account can create 2 environments. That account can only create 250 flows. If you're thinking that you're going to end up creating a generic, Flow Power App admin account, then you're going to get limited by the number of flows that you can create and the number of environments that you can create. Even if you're an IT admin and you want to go and provision your IT dev and IT production instances, and if in reality you're going through a change control process where you go from dev to production, and you've only got 250 flows that you can create, that's 125 flows that you uniquely are going to be developing, right? Might seem like a huge number to some of you, but we've certainly worked with organizations that have thousands of workflows, and you want to be able to plan for that up front. Another thing in terms of total connections, right? So each account can only have 100 connections within their explicit instance, right? So if I've got 125 unique flows and each one of those flows connects to a different line of business data, I'm going to be stuck from that perspective. Similarly, from an actions per workflow, being able to have a workflow of 250 actions, if you do that, you're insane. We certainly don't recommend anything even relatively close to it. But if you're trying to be clever and if you're trying to go, well, I've only got 250 flows that I can create, and I'm only doing that across 2 instances, so let me jam pack as much as I can into a specific workflow, and maybe I'll use that common data service to try to control the state that I'm in. Maybe you're going to be a rebel and try to use those 250. And the last is, look, the way that you actually query values within Flow, right? You can query a list item and then you get the result of that list item, and then you want to do something based on a value of that list item. So you sort of end up nesting a lot of actions together in order to do that. You can only have 5 of those nested actions maximum. I could see that potentially being a limit, but the rest of it, none of these things should frankly be showstoppers for you from a limitations perspective. So we've talked about the different environments. What we haven't talked about too much is how do we do our change management and change control process to go from, let's say, that phenomenal dev to test to UAT to production. So there are certainly capabilities around importing, exporting, around app packaging. So we've got our Power Apps and Flows, and thankfully enough, both Power App and Flow are supported through this app packaging. What's nice is you can go to one of your environments, you can go to your actions, and you can export your Power App and Flow. And then when you do that, you certainly have the ability of later on importing that, let's say, into another environment. When you import that Power App or Flow into a new environment, you've got 2 abilities. You can either create it as new, obviously, right? First time we're rolling this out. But what's nice is you can actually update those applications and flows themselves. One of the things that you need is you need to be an environment maker in order to import, right? Because again, environment makers are the roles that can go and create these Power Apps and Flows. So you've got to have that environment maker capability in order to do this app packaging import as well. So anybody that has those Power App Plan 2 licenses, or in reality a Power App Plan 2 trial, has that capability. So we talked about the Power Apps and Flows. There's also, that common data service. Common data service has, generic entities and customizations and pick lists and stuff. And that is also supported through that app packaging. However, any custom connectors, connections, gateways, maybe some of the other common data service capabilities is not currently supported in that app packaging import. So something to keep in mind when you're going through your production rollouts is, if you've got any of those custom connectors or connections, they have to be rebuilt, and then you can import your Power App and Flow. So we've gone through, I think, a lot of the fundamentals on just understanding the administrative capabilities of Power Apps and Flow, and maybe understanding roles and responsibilities, etc. So now what we want to do is we want to just take a look at some of those things that we've talked about, and sort of just identify an initial governance plan, right? And this is just a recommendation. Recognize that every organization is going to be different. Every organization probably already has a generic governance plan for Office 365 if you're using it, or they've got a governance plan around, whatever their workflow process tool would be today. And this is sort of taking that and adopting it and enhancing it for these new capabilities. Right, so sort of the first thing that we want to talk about is licensing and understanding the user base that you have, defining who are going to truly be those environment admins and environment makers, and then once you've identified who those would be, right, recognize what environments you might want to create. As we mentioned before, each environment admin can only create 2 environments. So if you end up wanting to have dev and test across all of your different locations, then you're going to need to have an admin for each of those locations, right? And we certainly would recommend that, but we recommend creating environments for locations where you're actually going to require multilingual support, right? I don't need a Flow instance for New York and New Jersey and Connecticut and California, right? That doesn't necessarily make sense. We're all sort of doing the same activities, and we're all doing it within the same language. What you want to sort of identify from a environment perspective is keep the idea of that dev and test as in production as much as you can, right? Again, we never had that capability in the SaaS world before, and all of us developers that have been doing this for many years, we've always developed in a dev environment and rolled it out for UAT, and then taken that UAT data and rolled it into production, right? So the fact that we have that ability again is great. So let's take advantage of that. Another recommendation from an environment perspective, as I mentioned, customer experience has changed. I mean, if you guys have a ton of Power Apps and Flows created in that initial default environment, maybe this isn't something that is as easy to do, but I would certainly recommend creating a new default environment that is going to take advantage of that Dynamics 365 admin. That is where it is going to live from now on. Again, it's part of the the process part, less the collaborative aspect of O365. If everybody's excited to go and see the capability around being able to create a Power App as a SharePoint list item form, right? That at least is something that we don't need any of those Plan 2 licenses for. So today, just with the generic Power Apps for Office 365, we don't need to use InfoPath anymore. We can start redeveloping those InfoPath forms and Power Apps forms, and we can go and we connect a SharePoint list or library to one of those new Power Apps forms themselves. So that's great. We recommend you kind of do some environment scenarios as we've identified here. One thing to highlight, right? So maybe one of your environments is going to use the common data service. And as I mentioned before, right, you need a Plan 2 license to create the common data service, that database itself, but you also need a paid plan in order to pull information out of it. So if we really are using that common data service to be able to store some values of data, across the flows, you want to create an environment maybe where all of the users have a Plan 1 license, and those are the ones that have the ability of executing those flows because they're going to be pulling the common data service values in. Another scenario is, let's think about secure content and intellectual property, let's call it. So maybe we've got an HR environment, and HR does a lot around creating new policies and procedures and benefits, and that stuff is not something that is truly available for the overall organization until it's gone through its workflow, it's gone through its review process, and it's finally published for public consumption. So maybe you want to end up having a specific environment for HR where they can go and they can process and work on those documents, but maybe they can also connect to an HRIS system, right? And you build those connections in that HR environment itself. And then last, we've talked about enough is being able to create environments that are truly targeted to your geolocation and have that multilingual support. Obviously, data loss prevention and creating those data groups, something that we've got to put in our governance plan as well. It's great for security trimming, but remember your environments are already sort of security trimmed, right? So you could probably get yourself into a point where you're over engineering some of the capabilities. Don't bury your data too many levels deep, or else you might end up having to create duplicate connections for things, and you don't want to do that, right? So take a look at, you've got your business data here, we've got Dynamics 365, we've got SharePoint, right? That business data is in that data group for a specific policy, for a specific environment. So remember that you can actually have multiple data policies for environments, and those data policies have the ability of having different data connections in those groups. Think about capacity planning. If you guys plan on using that common data service for a lot, there's a 10 gig limit. And you can only have 5 terabytes for file storage if you want to be able to push documents and content up into that common data service as well. And last, keep in mind that flow quota and those flow quota run rates, right? So remember, I said you're going to get a default 2,000 flow runs per generic Flow or Power App user that you have within Office 365. You can have up to 15,000 flow run rate for those administrators with the Plan 2 licenses. Aggregate all that together, and that's how much you've got from a quota perspective. Don't create a ton of infinite loops though, right? Because each time that you're going and querying an action that exists in a flow, if you've got that in some repetitive loop, you're actually hitting against your flow quota every single time you're doing that. So instead, do things that are much more trigger based, really take advantage of things like that common data service where, you execute a certain part of your flow and it sits and runs, and then you can trigger another execution of that flow. Maybe it's another flow that you're doing. Remember, the flow runs every 5 minutes. You can cut that down to every minute with the flow plan too, if you really want to. But most of us have been dealing with SharePoint and timer jobs and search and 15 minutes is what we're used to. So 5 minutes to me seems like something that should be good enough, at least for the flows to execute on a consistent basis. Last consideration that I would have is, look, flow is a nice enhancement, right? We haven't really had much in terms of a what you see is what you get sort of flow designer. I understand SharePoint Designer and Visio have kind of had that, but it's always been convoluted where you're mixing and mashing SharePoint Designer and Visio into that process. From a UI perspective, from a usability perspective, Flow certainly provides something that we haven't really had in the past. The ability of being able to pull content from multiple different technologies, from CRM, from Project Online, from OneDrive, from SharePoint, copying content across all of that, right? That's stuff that we've had to develop custom workflows or custom code for in the past, and Flow certainly gives us the ability of bridging the gap from that perspective. But Flow's not a business process management tool, right? Flow's good for approvals and reviews and copying content and updating list item values, like I said. Flow even has the ability of, you can export a flow into something called a logic app, right? So logic app is basically an Azure-based platform as a service workflow tool, very much like Flow is your SaaS model. Logic apps is your platform as a service model. And that has integration into some other line of business data as well. But frankly, that still isn't even a business process tool, right? So while you're sort of identifying and defining what you want to start leveraging Flow for, if you guys are already running third-party tools, recognize where those third-party tools may still have a fit today, right? So, you know, I was at an MTC session with Microsoft not too long ago, and they were talking about Power Apps and Flow, and they said, look, we're continually evolving it, and we all recognize that, right? But there's a reason why InfoPath is end of life in, you know, 2020 and beyond, because they don't expect the capabilities that even InfoPath has to be rolled up into Power Apps until that time, right? So, you know, same sort of goes with SharePoint Designer and the Workflow Manager. Recognize that SharePoint 2019 is coming out, and maybe some of those capabilities may end up being deprecated because there is things like Flow now. But again, in reality, we're not ready to lift and shift every single potential process that we have. There's still reason to have custom add-ins in SharePoint. There's still reason to build, you know, custom applications and stuff. You know, 5 years from now, you know, I'm sure that Power Apps and Flow is going to be our no-code solution for a lot of these capabilities. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. And even if you look at the visual designer, the IDE for Power Apps, you know, if you ask me, that still looks a little bit like Visual Studio. You know, it doesn't look like a designer would look like for, you know, let's say Nintex's responsive forms, where it's extraordinarily intuitive to the end users. You still have got a lot of configuration. You've got to set up the different screens that you've got on here. You've got to set up the way of being able to navigate across those screens. So, you know, it still requires a bit of a technical person in order to develop some of those forms themselves. So, for the most part, that's what we've got defined as sort of a generic Power Apps and Flow governance recommendation. Again, certainly would be more than happy to work with organizations and take a look at what they have for existing governance and sort of define a plan around their needs, as well as what we understand from a Power Apps and Flow perspective. So that being said, you know, we're about at time, so we'll just throw it up for any questions.
Thank you very much, Justin. As Justin had mentioned, right now we are open to questions. So just a reminder, if you do have any, please type those in the questions box and we'll get to those as they come through. The first question, Justin, we have had come through during the presentation, and that is, do you happen to know how those plans work for education plans?
So education plans and government plans, so that's something that is sort of being rolled out today. I know that the government plans do not have Power Apps and Flow in there. I believe that the education plans do, and there are plans very similar to the L1 and L2, which would provide those same capabilities. Honestly, I don't know the costs off the top of my head for those, though.
Thank you, Justin. The next one we have had is no concept of a service account flow, question mark, somewhere you can publish enterprise flows, etc.
So those enterprise flows would end up having to be in that default flow instance, right? And that default flow instance would be something that you've got for, you know, all of your end users. They're going to access that. There is no true enterprise global, right? There's nothing like snippets today. It's very much defined just at that environmental level itself.
Thank you. The next question is, how do the Plan 2 trial licenses play into this? Can you use the trials to create the environment? What happens when the trial expires?
Yeah, so that's a good point, and those trial licenses are really the death of us IT administrators, because there's no way of not allowing an end user to sign up for a Plan 2 trial license. and it gives them full capabilities. So yes, absolutely, those Plan 2 trials have the ability of creating the environments, et cetera, et cetera. The trials go for 90 days, and it's full access. And what ends up happening after the 90 days of that trial, if you want to continue leveraging an environment, so any Power App or any flow that is deployed in that environment, you've got to assign an owner to that environment that has a paid subscription license.
Okay. The next question is, can Nintex and Flow work together side by side for Office 365?
If you're looking for integration between the two, sure. Both have the ability of having, web service calls and REST API calls, et cetera. So if there are some complex actions that maybe Nintex provides that Flow doesn't today, and you wanted to call a Nintex workflow, you certainly could do that, especially with the fact that Nintex has something called Nintex Workflow Cloud, right? NWC is a capability that actually exists outside of the realm of SharePoint. So it's almost like a logic app where it sits in Azure, it's its own sort of process. So you certainly could from Flow call a Nintex Workflow Cloud workflow. If you wanted to have some of your workflows be Flow, right? So your general reviews and approvals and item updates, if you want that stuff to be Flow. And then if you want to continue doing, let's say, site provisioning workflows where, you fill out a form and you want to choose a site template and you want that site to automatically be created and some default metadata assigned, right? Then you certainly could continue leveraging something like a Nintex to do that. So you can run them in parallel as well as you could integrate them together.
Thank you, Justin. The next question is, when you spoke of accounts, I foresee a business continuity problem for the long run, in the long term. Do you know if licensing will be compliant if the account is a service account so that individual people are not owning the apps or flows from an enterprise perspective?
Yeah, so you certainly, look, I feel like as long as the subscription is being paid for, right? It doesn't matter if it's an actual named account or a service account. I mean, we certainly have used service accounts for things in the past, like CRM, right? You want to go and you want to create workflows in CRM, maybe you create a CRM service account. Or if you want to be able to query CRM from SharePoint, and you want to use a service account in order to manage that authentication. I mean, one thing that you want to keep in mind, though, is if you're creating that service account, what level of security do you have from that service account, and how many people are you giving that username and password out to, right? That would be the concern from my perspective there. But absolutely, you can define some service level accounts and have them be the ones that are the account owners and admins. I mean, probably very similar to what you might have in terms of a tenant admin. You just have a generic Office 365 tenant administrator account, which maybe a bunch of your IT admins have. But one thing, again, to keep in mind are some of those limitations at that service account level. You're only going to be able to create 2 environments. You're only going to be able to create 250 flows, etc. So you'll need, let's call them those service accounts for each grouping of environments that you might want to deploy. And again, that's a new paid license of that Office 365 subscription.
Okay. The next question we have is there a way that I, as an admin, can view all of the flows created in a specific environment? If someone creates a flow and leaves the company, how can I take ownership of that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that's something that we showcased in the administrative aspect of either Office 365 or Dynamics 365, right? So you've got the ability of, as a environment owner, admin, being able to see all of the entities assigned to that environment. And within that, you can drill into each one of those unique flows or Power Apps, and you can assign a new owner to that. So if anybody leaves the organization, you don't necessarily lose anything that they've done or lose the ability of enhancing any of their work product. So you can go and assign a new owner from those admin consoles.
Okay. The next question is, My users have been signing up for the Plan 2 trial. Is there any way that I can disable that capability for my tenant?
Again, that's going to be the same problem that we talked about before, where any user has the ability of going and signing up for those trials. It's Microsoft's upsell, and today there is not a way to be able to disallow individuals from signing up for corporate trial accounts.
Okay, thank you very much, Justin. As there are no more questions, this does conclude today's webinar. A recording of this will be sent to all participants, along with the link to accept the complimentary Microsoft Power Apps and Flow Plan 2 trial. You will each be receiving our survey as well. Please take a few moments and provide your feedback on today's webinar. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please contact us at info@microexcel.com. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.